Good afternoon and Assalamu alaikum. On behalf of Oxford University Press Pakistan, I would like to welcome you to our live webinar week for professional development. Today is the day one of the series of webinars we have arranged for educators. The title of today's webinar is Foundation of Reading. Before we commence into the session, I have few announcements to make. There will be a 6-second delay in the transmission to all participants as we go live. The chat box is open for question and comments throughout the session, and question and answers will be addressed in the last 15 minutes of the session. All registered participants will receive e-certificates, and the link for today's handout will also be pasted in the announcements section. Let us now proceed with the session. The session has been put together by Ayesha Jabbar. Ayesha Jabbar is a teacher trainer and a language and literacy professional with a broad experience in teaching, training, curriculum, and content development. She had a degree in Applied Linguistics from Kinnaird College for Women and a master's degree in education from University of Melbourne, Australia. She currently works at Oxford University Press as an educational consultant. Over to you, Ayesha.
Thank you, Amna. So today's session is on foundations of reading, and just give me a minute to turn my video on. Hi, I hope you can see me now.
Ayesha, we cannot see you, but we can see your presentation.
All right,
you have to turn on the video.
Yeah, there seems to be some problem. All right, so welcome to today's session. The video should work in a bit. So today's session is about foundations of reading. And we'll be talking about reading instruction and practice. The video is lagging a bit. It should work in a minute or so. Till then, let's just talk about foundations of reading and what reading is all about. So today's session will, it has two co-components. We're going to talk about what foundation, what are the main components of reading. And then we'll talk about reading instruction and see how the three translates into practice in the classroom. So all the essential components of reading instruction, and then talking about instructional models in the classroom. So just going through what we'll be discussing today, we are hoping that by the end of the session, we'll all have a better understanding of reading and the components of reading instruction. We will also talk about early instruction in early primary and later primary years. And essentially, we'll be looking at the shift in reading instruction. What is the focus of reading instruction in the early primary, and then how does that focus shift towards the later primary years? We'll also discuss and talk about the interplay between vocabulary, grammar, and reading ability, and how do you provide guided reading instruction? And we'll talk about reading comprehension skills. So what are reading skills? Let's have a look at what reading skill is and what is essentially reading. So reading is a learned skill. It's an acquired skill, quite unlike speech, which is a natural skill. So when we are born, we have the ability to speak and hear and listen. Reading, on the other hand, is a taught skill. So when we talk about reading, we look at how to teach reading, particularly because the human mind is not naturally designed to teach reading or to learn reading on its own. So when we talk about reading, we have to look at how to teach it, because it's slightly more difficult and challenging than other skills. Reading is an incredibly complex process, so it doesn't engage one or two parts of the brain. It is a whole brain activity, and it engages different parts of the brain. So that means when we start teaching reading, we have to consider that not only is it something that needs to be explicitly taught and developed over the years, the other challenge is that it is incredibly complex. And a lot of the different parts of the brain are engaged in reading. It needs to be explicitly taught. So it's not something that the students will naturally get a hold of if they just spend time in reading. Although independent reading helps, it does not compensate for reading instruction. So it needs to be explicitly taught. That means we have to take out time for teaching each and every individual skill of reading. Reading instruction should focus on all different components of reading. So we're not talking about one or two components over here. We're looking at all different components. We're going to look at all of these components in detail in a bit, but just keep in mind that when you're talking about reading instruction, we need to cover all of these different instructional components while we're designing our content. Anna, can you see my video now? Is it working?
Ayesha, the video is not working, but I can clearly see the presentation.
All right. All right, so let's head on to a couple of questions. I will keep posting questions and I want you to type in your responses. I'll be looking at your responses in the chat window. So if you can type in your responses to some of the questions that I put up over here, that would be great. So I'm going to start off with, how should we teach reading? So we've looked at reading as a complex process and that it needs to be explicitly taught. We've also looked at how reading is a very complicated process and it's a learned skill, so it doesn't happen naturally. It needs to be taught. All of the components need to be taught. But then, what implications does it have for teaching? How should we teach reading? And how is it different from other skills that we teach? What are the components, core components of reading? Can reading be improved through independent reading practice or not? So let's talk about the first two. What are the core components of reading and how should we teach reading? If you have any ideas or any tips to share, please feel free to type in your responses in the chat window. So if you have any ideas or any tips on how to teach reading, what the core components are, please feel free to type in your responses. Great, so I see some responses coming in. All right, so yes, by making it interesting, that's a good idea. You should make reading interesting. Engagement is one of the most important skills that we need to, it is one of the most important areas that we need to focus on while we're teaching reading. And we have to understand how to make it engaging and interesting for all. So thank you for that idea. That's a very interesting one. Let's move on to the next question. Can reading be improved through independent reading practice? So if you're not doing anything as such for reading instruction in the classroom, but we are encouraging students to practice on their own, will that improve reading or not? What do you think? Yes or no? So we're not talking about instruction yet. We haven't really done much to teach the components of reading, but we're talking about instruction. But we're talking about improving reading through practice, independent practice. So, for example, you have a student in the class who doesn't read very well. You assign that student extra time to read. Is that going to improve the student's reading or not? Okay, you can type in your responses, your opinion, yes or no. What do you think about it? Meanwhile, let's talk about, let's move on to the next question. What can teachers do to improve students' reading skills? Do you have any tried and tested strategies that really work? What can we as teachers do to improve students' reading abilities? So we can make the lesson interesting. We can bring in books that the students are interested in. Any ideas on how to improve students' reading ability? What can we do in the classroom? So we'll discuss this in more detail in just a bit. Let's find the answers for all of these questions. So by the end of the session, I'm hoping you will be comfortable in answering all of these questions. Because we'll be talking about each of the component in detail. So let's look at the 5 core components of reading. This consensus pretty much everywhere that these are the 5 core components of reading. They're suggested by the National Panel of Reading in the USA, and they are followed through in all different countries. So the 5 basic components of reading are phonemic awareness and phonics. Fluency is, of course, very important as well, and so is vocabulary and comprehension. Now, looking at phonemic awareness and phonics, these are the core components that you're looking at developing in the early years of reading. So starting from preschool till grade 1 and 2, we are working on phonemic awareness and phonics instruction. So phonemic awareness is an umbrella term. We look at the basic recognition of sounds. We also look at, when we're talking about phonemic awareness, we're also looking at understanding sounds as a core unit of words, but also manipulating sounds. So, putting sounds together, deleting sounds, adding a sound, and seeing how that changes the word. We are also looking at syllables, identification of syllables within words, and then rhyme and rhythm and all of those things that have to do with the knowledge and understanding of sounds in a language. Phonics is a sub-skill of phonemic awareness, but it's a very important skill in learning to read and spell. So what you do with phonics is that you introduce the basic units of sound in a language. So English, for instance, has 44 sounds. So any phonic program would teach all of those 44 sounds and would also teach some core skills such as blending and segmenting. So blending is where you put those sounds together to make words. So for example, cat, the students will identify k at ch, but then also be able to blend k at cat to read the word cat. And likewise, if they stretch the word cat, they can identify that there are 3 sounds within the word k, a, t, and they can use this segmenting skill to spell words. So these 2 skills, blending and segmenting, are interchangeable. A lot of time and energy goes into developing phonemic awareness and phonics in the early years of reading. So up till grade 1 and 2, students should be fairly comfortable identifying sounds, blending them and segmenting them to read and write. Fluency is also really important, and grade 1 onwards, we start working towards the end of kindergarten actually as well. And then throughout grade 1 and 2, we work on developing fluency. the focus initially is to develop fluency in reading words, and later on we develop fluency in reading paragraphs and texts as a whole. Vocabulary is of course very important. If you don't know what the words mean, you don't really understand them, do you? Right? So vocabulary instruction is really important, and so is comprehension. If you don't understand what you're reading, there's really no point in reading. So we've got to teach all of these components. Now let's look at the core skills for reading, and this is the model that is currently followed all over the world in contemporary research and practice on reading instruction. And so what this model states, this is called the simple view of reading, and what it really explicitly sets out is that the reading process has two core components, right? One of the components of reading is decoding, where you are reading words, and the other component is language comprehension. So it says that you need to be able to read the words, word recognition, and then you need to understand. You have to have some basic skills of understanding language. And if you have these two, then it can translate into good reading skills. So the first skill is word recognition. If the word recognition is poor, then we need to work on word recognition so that students can get to good word recognition skill, and then language comprehension needs to be good as well. So these are the two areas that we need to work on. What does this imply for classroom practice? So the simple view of reading, what it does is it really simplifies the reading process. It says there are two core things that you need to teach. And it shows that reading comprehension depends on both decoding skills and language comprehension. So if you cannot read the written word, you will not really be able to read anything. And if you can read words, but you don't understand anything, then there's really no point in reading as well. And the good thing with simple view of reading, again, is that it simplifies things for us. It says that, it states that for struggling readers, we need to design intervention for struggling readers, right? So it guides us on how to effectively do that by addressing student-specific weakness. And it also elaborates how teaching and language comprehension can be separated for teaching and assessment. And we're going to look at that in a bit on how to do it through guided reading. Now, the simple view of reading is credible. It's backed by a lot of research, and it can be used to predict individual reading scores for children as well. So these are the two core skills that we're talking about, and these are the sub skills. So for the students to be able to identify and recognize words, they need to be able to identify sounds in the words. They need to be able to blend the sounds to read words. And then we also teach sight words. Reading sight words, and we're going to talk about teaching sight words in a bit in detail. And then the other skill is language comprehension. I'm just going to quickly walk you through the key skills in language comprehension. And when we talk about reading comprehension in particular, we're going to look at these skills in detail. So students, to be able to comprehend a language, should be able to make predictions. They should be able to ask questions about the text they're reading, summarize main ideas, ask questions to clarify for meaning, and they should be able to imagine and picture what they're hearing or reading. So let's look at the simple view of reading and how to use it in the classroom in guided reading sessions. So we've identified that there are two skills. We've also discussed how we need to look at how we can separate instruction and assessment for word reading and language comprehension. So this model explains how to do that. So you have four kinds of groups within each class. Four possibilities, right? In terms of students' reading abilities, you might have students who have really good word recognition skills, and their language comprehension is really good as well. So right, so we've got this group over here. Then you can have students who have poor word recognition, but their language comprehension is fine. And then we've got another group where you have poor word recognition and poor comprehension process, right? So they lack in both areas. And then you can have another group of students who have poor language comprehension, but their word recognition skills are good. So they've got the decoding bit sorted, but their language comprehension isn't great. So they're reading words, but they don't understand what they're reading. Now, these groups vary in their instructional needs. So if you have the same kind of instruction, it's not going to work for all of these students, right? And that's what actually happens within the reading classroom. We have so many students who have their different needs. Their needs are not met. What happens is usually we end up focusing on students who cannot read words. And so the entire lesson is focused on decoding, right? We read and the students reread after us. Now that might work for some students, but it doesn't work for all. So what we've got to do in reading practices, we've got to use this guided reading model, which helps us break apart the processes of reading and then design our instruction to match the student's need. For example, if we have a group of students who have poor word recognition skills, so their decoding skills are really bad, but their language comprehension is fine, then we need to put them in a small group, and our instruction needs to focus on phonics, because it is word recognition that they're lacking in, right? If we keep teaching them comprehension, their word reading skills are not going to improve. And so their reading skills are not going to improve. So focus on phonics for these students. Then if you have students who have poor word recognition, but their language comprehension is also poor, and we have quite a few of these in the classroom, particularly in the early years, because students are still learning to decode and they're still developing their language comprehension skills. So for these students, the correct way to go about it, or the recommended way to go about, is to focus on decoding first. The students need to be, as the first, the rule of thumb is that the students need to be able to read the written word first for them to be able to understand, right? No matter, let me give you an example. No matter how good your comprehension skills are, if I give you a very basic sentence in Chinese or any other language that you are not familiar with, and you cannot understand the alphabet or the code of that language, there's no way you'll be able to understand that text or read it at all. So the same goes for students as well. They can see a code, the English language, but if they're not familiar with that code, they will struggle with reading. They will always struggle with reading with all skills. So you've got to focus on decoding first. For students who have good word recognition process, good decoding skills, but poor language comprehension, you will of course focus on teaching comprehension. So you put them together in a small group, you give them tasks related to comprehension, and maybe you can go in for a minute or two and guide them on how to do it. And then for students who have good language comprehension and good word reading skills, need to move on. If we keep giving them very basic level tasks that all students are doing, then they're going to lose interest in reading, because it's just too easy for them, right? So it's too easy to engage them or to interest them. So for these students, you need higher level comprehension tasks. We will discuss some high level comprehension tasks when we are discussing reading strategies, and we'll see how we can use these tasks to engage the students. And that's what you said in the beginning as well, right? You said it's very important to engage students. It's very important to keep them interested in reading. So that's a very valid point. Now let's look at reading development. How does reading develop throughout primary school? So what's the focus? Let's look at reading development in grades 1 and 2. So here are some aspects that we need to look at, particularly in grade 1 and grade 2. So in grade 1 and 2, the students are still developing their decoding skills. Technically, at the end of grade 1 and grade 2, towards the mid of grade 2, students should be able to read all sounds patterns. So all phonemes, all sounds, they should be able to identify them. And towards the end of grade 1, they should be able to identify some common spelling patterns, right? So for the same sound, let's say for sound, they should be able to identify that the l sound, which is generally denoted by the letter L, can also be denoted by the letters L and E. So these different spelling patterns are gradually introduced in grade 1 and 2, and students get comfortable and practice reading through these. So the decoding should be fairly developed by the end of grade 2, right? So that means we need to teach it specifically. So that's not going to happen automatically. Whatever reading program you're following, it needs to have a solid component of phonics instruction, where you are directly, remember we spoke about how we need to teach every skill directly. So you need to teach phonics directly. You need to teach the spelling patterns directly. And once they become comfortable in that, then we can integrate it with other components of language instruction. Towards the end of the session, we're going to see how do we integrate all of these things together with other components of language teaching. So they need to be able to decode first. We also need to teach them sight words, right? So that they can automatically read words and they develop fluency. And then we need to, once they've developed word level reading fluency, we need to move on towards textual fluency, where they read like they speak. So, naturally, not like robots. Some students who's struggling with reading will read in a very mechanical way, right? So if they're reading a sentence, they will say, this is a cat. So it's very slow and laborious. What it does is that, when students are done reading the sentence, they don't even remember the format of words, and so they don't understand what they're reading. So we need to develop sentence level fluency as well. Gap filling and closed passages are really helpful in doing that. So lots of reading practice through gap filling and closed passages in grades 1 and 2, particularly gap filling is really, really helpful. We're going to see some examples of that towards the later bit of our presentation. Students should be able to read longer words. So syllabification needs to be taught, which is breaking words down into syllables. For example, this word over here, reading, has 2 syllables, read, ing, right? So students should be able to identify these syllables. And a really quick tip for that is that you have students identify the vowels, because syllables are always clustered around vowels. So if I can identify the vowel sound over here, which is E, read, and another vowel sound, E, ing. So I can very easily then break this word down into syllables. So that's a key skill for grade 1 and 2, because students will now see longer words and they're going to struggle reading them if they cannot break it down into syllables. And then reading comprehension, of course, is really, really important. It becomes increasingly important in the later part of grade 2 and throughout grade 3 as well. So we've been talking about teaching sight words as part of a decoding strategy. Now, sight words are common high frequency words that need to be recognized quickly without sounding them out. What we're really doing is we're developing speed in reading, speed and accuracy. Sight word instruction helps with develop fluency and automaticity in word recognition. So fluency in terms of reading words can be achieved through sight word instruction. Some sight words are really tricky though. They have spelling patterns and phonic patterns that the students are not familiar with. So they cannot be decoded by just using phonic knowledge. So how do we teach these words? We're going to talk about this in a bit, but the first most important principle in sight word instruction is multiple exposure. So you've got to familiarize students with these words till they become automatic in just looking at these words and recognizing them. But it cannot be done in one single step. So you directly teach sight words first. Then you provide multiple exposures, as you can see over here. You provide them a lot of practice, a lot of exposure. So, put up sight words on flashcards and practice reading them with the class, before you start reading the story. So, maybe if I'm reading a story, if I identify there are at least 3 sight words in the story, I'm going to put them up on flashcards and practice reading them as a before reading strategy. I can put up word walls where there are sight words, so that you can frequently between lessons practice those sight words. There are lots of other ways to do it as well. You can make sight word, finding sight words, an interesting game when students are playing, are reading a story. You can give them 5 minutes to quickly identify any sight words that they've learned in the story. So it needs to be done through multiple exposures and different activities. Then you need to inbuild frequent practice. Whenever they're reading, have them practice sight words. Maybe, stop reading for a while, have students look at the sight word wall, and then find those words in the text that they've read or the paragraph that they've just read so far. You can also have sight word lists in the end of, towards the end of students' notebooks, so that they can read these words and they can practice spelling and reading these words. Then it's really important to keep all students on the same page. So you need intervention and extension work. Intervention struggle a lot with sight. A lot of students who have poor reading skills also have poor working memory, right? And so because they have poor working memory, that means they need more practice and more time, more instruction, so that they can come to par with other students. So you need to plan your interventions accordingly. You need to you need to have extension work for students who are quick to learn, right? And you need reinforcement for all students. Sorry, just to give you an idea of how the instruction time or the practice can vary for students. While an average reader needs to see a word for anywhere from 4 to 14 times for it to become a sight word, so that they can automatically recognize. A student who's struggling, let's say a student with dyslexia, for instance, will need to look at the word at least 40 times, 40. So you see how different the range of instruction time and exposure to the text can be. Eventually they will learn how to identify these sight words. It's just that they need more practice, more instruction, smaller groups where you work with them individually. And so sight word instruction, a really good way to integrate sight word, because we need a lot of practice, right? We just looked at how much practice is required. So a really good way is to integrate sight word instruction with grammar. We've discussed how to do it with reading, how do you integrate in before reading and after reading exercises, but a really good way to improve sight word reading is to integrate it with grammar. Now I've taken these 2 pages from our book, The Grammar Tree, which is an excellent resource for teaching grammar, and it focuses on all core components. So grammar and vocabulary are integrated, which is great because you need both. You need grammar and vocabulary to teach reading as well. So some of the grammar words, some of these words like joining words or pronouns are also sight words. So he, she, they, you are going to see them very frequently in text, and the students need to be able to identify them quickly. Now he, she, they are also tricky words. So these are the kind of high frequency words that have tricky spelling patterns. For example, he, the students have learned the h sound, and for the letter E, they've learned the S sound. But over here, the letter E represents the long E sound. So this is taught as a sight word because student cannot read it with just phonic, with using just their phonic knowledge. And so because it's also a longer word, but it comes very frequently in children's texts, and they are using it very often. So it's a good idea to integrate it with sight word instruction and have them practice as sight words. Some more sight word practice over here. So whenever you're doing these grammar exercises, make it a point to use your flashcards, to use your teaching resources to pre-teach and reteach sight words. so that even for students who are struggling, there's enough teaching and practice for them to be able to recognize these. And then your spelling practice is an excellent way to integrate decoding and sight word practice, right? So I've just highlighted some irregular spelling patterns over here. 2-letter one sounds that can be confusing for students. 3 letters one sound. So remember, we discussed how in decoding we are now moving on to spelling patterns. So they're being introduced to IGH as a code for the I sound. So I, ch. So maybe have them, when they're learning spelling, maybe have them highlight or underline these spelling anomalies. So we've got reading comprehension then. Once students are able to decode words, even when they're learning to decode words, we start teaching and practicing reading comprehension as well. So what is reading comprehension? Please feel free to share your ideas as we talk about reading comprehension. So what are you required to do in reading comprehension? We should be able to understand. We're required to understand the text. We are, we're looking at extracting meaning from text, interpreting text, constructing meaning to understand text, using our own background knowledge and our own experiences to understand text. So, so all of that is really, really important in reading comprehension. So essentially, we're not just looking at knowledge of the word, understanding what words mean, but we're also looking at a knowledge of the world. Students' own experiences, their own understanding of things is really important as well. Let's just watch this video very quickly to see what reading comprehension is all about.
Reading comprehension is the ability to read a written text and understand its meaning. It relies on 2 interconnected abilities: word reading, being able to decode the words on the page, and language comprehension, being able to understand the meaning of those words, whether they're written down or just spoken. To read well, both abilities need to be taught and developed. When we read, we don't normally remember the exact words and phrases of the entire text. Instead, we build a mental model, a picture in our head of what's happening and what the text is telling us. The planet glowed brightly in the night sky. Our mental model grows as we read more of the text. We add to it or change it as we come across new ideas and new information. The clearer our mental model, the better our understanding of the whole text. And there are 4 factors that can help this model to grow: background knowledge, vocabulary, language structures, and inference.
So these are really the 4 kind of key things that we need to work on when we are teaching comprehension. Now, let's see how to do it. So for students to be able to do all of that, they need to have some core skills, right? And going back to how we teach reading, we discussed how everything needs to be explicitly taught. So students need to be able to predict what's going to happen in the story by looking at the title, by looking at the picture, by reading part of the text, and then, predicting what's going to happen next. So they can make predictions about the theme, the plot, or the events in the story. Students should be able to ask questions. So if they're reading something, they should be able to ask questions about the author's intent, what the author is trying to say, why the characters are behaving in a certain way. They should be able to ask those critical questions. Remember, when we were talking about key skills, we also discussed how asking for clarifications is a very important skill. So asking questions is obviously a very important part of it. Making connections. Students should be able to make connection to the text, text to text connection. So, if they are reading a story about dinosaurs, maybe they can remember and make a connection about, a lesson in the science class where they learned about dinosaurs. Right? And then they can, make that connection. Oh, well, I remember, dinosaurs can be herbivores or carnivores, and then use that information to understand the story. Students should also be able to make inferences. This is a very critical skill. And inferences are generally made about how the characters are feeling, what their thoughts are, what are they thinking, or what is the main motive of the characters? Why are they acting the way they're acting? We also infer implied meaning of text. So for example, if so this is essentially basically reading between the lines, right? We also use this skill in understanding what the author is really trying to say. For example, if you look at the story of the greedy dog, the story doesn't really say that the dog is being greedy, but we infer, we sort of read between the lines and understand that, because the dog has a bone already and tries to grab someone else's bone, he's being greedy, right? And so that underlying assertion, that implied meaning, understanding that implied meaning helps us understand the story. We also make inferences about the use of language, the tone that the writer uses, right? The choice of words that the writer uses, and we also use inference to understand meaning of new words. For example, if we, if you're reading a story and it says that the girl was ecstatic at, she felt ecstatic when she won the competition. Students might not know what that means, but we can train them to dig deeper and infer what the word ecstatic might mean. And so you can ask questions like, how would you feel if you won a competition? And so they'd say, we feel very excited, we'd feel very happy, we'd be overjoyed. And then you can say, well, that's what ecstatic means, right? And we can use the context to understand some of the words, some of the unfamiliar words that we come across when we're reading. So that's a key skill to learn. Students should be able to visualize whatever they're reading. They should be able to make a mental image of what they're reading. And like we just saw in the video, the better the mental image, the more detailed the mental image, the better will be the students' understanding of the story. We've also got to teach them to monitor the comprehension. Critical skill for early readers. Sometimes early readers will read something they don't understand, right? And then just keep reading. So what happens is they don't understand anything in the story. So we've got to train students to stop and ask questions, or to stop and ask for help where they cannot understand what they're reading. Another good comprehension monitoring strategy is to reread. So there's a lot of chance that if you read a passage thrice, you will understand things that you didn't understand in the first reading. So what are some practical ways to improve comprehension? You've got to teach decoding skills. We teach vocabulary and word knowledge. Active comprehension strategies. We just saw some comprehension strategies. We need to actively practice them in the classroom, and we need to teach them how to monitor their comprehension. Now, looking at how to teach reading. I really like the gradual release of responsibility model. It has 3 steps and it makes reading instruction really simple. So the first step is I do. The teacher will model the concept, whatever you're trying to teach, be it decoding or comprehension, you model first. So you don't tell students what to do, you show them what to do and how to do it. So for example, if I come across a longer word such as reading, I will model the the syllabification strategy. So I will tell them, all right, so this is a really long word. How do I read it? Maybe I can break it down into syllables, and then I'll say, OK, let me find, to break down the word down into syllables, I need to find the vowel. So the first vowel is over here, E and A, and you can take this opportunity to revisit and review the sound. So you can say the E and A letters represent the E sound, read, read, and there's another vowel over here, I, ing, read, ing. And so I can read this longer word like that, right? So you demonstrate how to do it. Then you have students work with you gradually to implement that strategy, right? They work together with you to work on the same skill. Maybe you have another longer word, and then some students, you can ask them, who can help me identify the vowel over here so that we can break down the word into syllables. So you gradually take them on, and then you move on to the you do stage where students work together in groups first and then move on to independent reading practice. So students are not just thrown into showing their ability in reading. They gradually that ability is gradually developed and scaffolded as you go along. right? And so this can be used for word reading and language comprehension as well. In language comprehension, of course, if you are teaching them a reading strategy, you're going to model that first by using Think Aloud, just like I did for word reading. And then you are going to have them join in and then practice it on their own. So the idea is to let go of responsibility one step at a time and to make students responsible for their learning. So I do, we do is where the teacher has most responsibility, and you do it together and you do it alone is where the students move on to take responsibility for their learning for all of it, right? And so for reading practice, we just discussed how we need to bring everything together, right? So the grammar, vocabulary, and comprehension bits need to come together for reading practice. Once you've instructed them on how to read, then when they're practicing their skills, they need multiple exposures. Remember, even for word reading and for comprehension and for vocabulary development. So it's a good idea to integrate reading instruction into your grammar, speaking, and listening lessons as well. So this is an example of the gap filling exercise that I was talking about. Again, I've taken this page from the grammar tree to see how we can integrate it. So what this passage does is that it is reinforcing some core words that have been taught, but we can so easily use it for reading instruction as well. We've already discussed how gap filling is an excellent way to practice reading and to develop fluency and speed. So be sure that before you start this practice, you do a mini lesson where you go over some of the tricky words again, right? So go is a tricky word over here because it doesn't represent the O sound, short O sound that the students initially learn, but the letter O represents the long O sound, G-O, right? So just practice these with students and then have them practice these exercises. So integrate your decoding skills when you are teaching them grammar. As for comprehension, again, teach them how to decode first. Remember, we were talking about guided reading and instructional groups. So pick out students who have poor word reading skills, and even though this is comprehension practice, but put them in a small group where you use flashcards to revise some sounds that the students are struggling with, or maybe practice some sight words that the students are struggling with, right? And then move on to comprehension. While the other students, let's say there are a couple of students in the class who are really good at word reading, you can put them down in a small group and they can start working on implementing some of the comprehension strategies that we just discussed. So differentiation in early reading instruction is critical, right? Again, whenever they're reading words or whenever they're practicing their vocabulary and grammar exercises, this is an excellent way for you to reinforce their phonic knowledge. So I've done this over here and I'll show you in a bit as well. What I've done is I've used an online platform to highlight these words. Now, if you are teaching online, which a lot of us are doing right now, you need to have some really excellent resources where you can highlight some of the words, the phonic patterns, while we're teaching them how to read. So I've highlighted some phonic patterns over here, such as this one. So k, ow, this is the ow sound, right? And the students, if they blend k, ow, they should be able to read the word ow, cow, right? And similarly, ow, l, owl. Right, and we have the O sound in goat, G-O-T. A lot of students will forget the two-letter one sound thing, right? So what they so they struggle with decoding because then they're reading G, O, A, T. So it doesn't really make a word. The word is goat. So what they're doing is they are misreading the sound. So you've got to reinforce that. And it's a good idea to reinforce all of this phonic knowledge in your lessons. And similarly in tiger, ER is the code for sound. So we're introducing and reinforcing vowel digraphs, although this is a vocabulary building exercise. Similarly over here, we can reinforce digraphs such as in ch, air. So these are two sounds. but the second sound is represented by 3 letters. Or you can draw attention to students towards graphemes such as A, E, N, K, K, A, K. But the letter K comes between the A sound, right? So this is a split grapheme. So you can highlight these things so it's easier for students to practice all of these. And so this can be done very easily with vocabulary games as well. The grammar tree has a lot of vocabulary development exercises and grammar exercises that are perfect for teaching and reinforcing decoding. So, you know, we've got some consonant blends over here that the students will continue to learn in grade 1 and 2, alternate spellings. So all of these things are pretty easy to identify. You will get a handout towards the end of the session, and your handout has all the alternate spellings that the student should be able to identify. So you can use those alternate spellings and find them in words and highlight them when you are teaching them your grammar lessons or your vocabulary lessons or your reading lessons for that matter. So, you know, this is a spelling and vocabulary exercise, but again, doubles as an excellent resource for practicing phonics, right? And that can be done for all of these. Now, these vocabulary development exercises are also really excellent way to reinforce sight words. And gap filling for reading, we've already discussed how gap filling is an excellent way to develop fluent reading, and a really good way for practicing sight words as well. So we've discussed some of these strategies already. We've discussed how we can use guided reading. We've also just looked at how to use gap filling and integrating vocabulary, grammar, and reading together to strengthen students' reading abilities. You can also integrate other strategies such as jigsaw reading, where students read part of the text, because we just saw how, you know, one thing can be used for so many different purposes. Now that requires time, right? And so you might want to break down, instead of having students read the entire text, not understanding any of it, you can break it down. So you can break down a longer, you know, a 1-page story into 4 paragraphs, divide the students into 4 groups, and have one group read the first paragraph, the other group read the second, third, and fourth, right? And then when they've read their paragraphs, when they've use their comprehension strategies and decoding skills in reading those, maybe you can pick one student from each group, put them in a new group, right? And they can learn from each other, right? So the idea is to implement these teaching strategies. That's what's going to be critical in teaching reading, and integrate, make time for that, right? And everything else can be integrated later. So I'm just going to quickly review what we've discussed so far, and then I'm going to go on to EMET and show you how we can practically use these strategies in our online classes, right? We learned how decoding, comprehension, vocabulary, and grammar are all important aspects of teaching reading and how they can be used in reading instruction. We also discussed how decoding and language comprehension are the 2 main components of reading process. Reading instruction needs to focus on both of these. And if we are not focusing on all the components of reading, then students will struggle with reading. Reading instruction should ideally be systematic, incremental, as in, you know, it gets progressively more difficult. So you start with simple and then you start adding things, and needs to be explicitly taught. Just like the gradual release of responsibility model, you model it and then you practice it with students and then you have them have a go. Fluency is really important for word reading and comprehension becomes increasingly important towards the end of grade 3. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to show you this really interesting program that we have, EMET, which has all of our learning resources, a lot of our learning resources that are matched to our local curriculums. So I'm going to show you a book which is available here in our learning content. So I'm going to go to the library and show you some of the books where I've already marked the components that I was talking to you about. So let's say I've got an online class, right? And I've got to cover my grammar lesson or my vocabulary lesson or my reading lesson. So in the planning phase, what you can do is you can identify all of the components that you need to integrate. So if I'm planning, I can use this first page, content page, to identify this, where I can integrate different things. So these are pronouns, but I can also use this as a reminder to myself. I've added here that I can use this to teach sight words, right? Then when I'm actually teaching, when I go on to book pages, I can highlight. So I've highlighted a couple of things over here. And I can, when I'm, delivering my class, I can focus on these sounds and I can reinforce that these are 2-letter-1 sounds, right? So I've made it really simple. I've just highlighted. So when students are reading, instead of me putting in time and really teaching everything, I've identified and highlighted these words. So when students are reading, I can remind them, remember, I've highlighted 2-letter-1 sounds and you can use it to decode these words, right? Similarly, I've highlighted 3-letter-1 sounds over here. Split diagrams over here.
Ayesha, sorry to cut you off. Could you please share once again? We cannot see the live version of eMate.
OK, let me just share my screen again. Can you see it now?
I hope it will take. Yes, perfect. Thank you.
OK, so I've highlighted. So, if you can just highlight things, Amna, while we're, and we all have set up our time for preparing for our lessons. If you can just highlight these things, then it becomes very easy for us to integrate it into our lessons as well. And likewise,
Ayesha, can you please show us like how you have highlighted, because we have missed that bit?
Yeah, sure, I'll do that. So there's this highlighting option over here, right? So I go up over here. So I have to select. So for example, these the double B represents the B sound, right? So I've selected it and I go on to highlight over here. Can you see it in the top right? So I select the color, right? And I can just, so I can either, underline or highlight. So I choose that option. I choose my color. And the double B, I underlined it right now, right? So you can see that it is now underlined. Now, if I want to see this, so the eMate is a really good way to implement blended learning in the classroom. So I can go onto my tab over here on the left, and it will show me everything that I've highlighted. So I just highlighted the double B sound right now, and I have highlighted all of these. So whenever I want to, let's say, revise a lesson, I can just go on to this section and we can revise all of the sounds and practice reading words. Similarly, if I want to find sight words, so I want to go to sight words, right? So I've added, just like I added the highlight feature, I can also add notes. So I will go on to notes and I can see all the pages where I've added notes. So let's say I wanted to teach decodable words and I have 5 minutes in my lesson and I want to revise it towards the end of the session. I'll just go on to notes, find my decodable words over here. And here I've added all the decodable words that the students need to revise. So it will literally take me 2 minutes to revise all of these words, and you will see how quickly the students' reading abilities will improve, right? So I'll just show you how I went on to the books. When you subscribe to eMate, to particular books, you will have all the books that you've subscribed to available over here, right? So let's say I want to go on to Grammar Tree Book 2. I'll head on to Grammar Tree Book 2 and I can use all of the features over here. There are lots of resources to use with the books as well. so they're hello. You go to the positions page for a later lesson, right? Maybe I want to integrate it with sight words, so I can add my bookmarks from here. And likewise, when I go on to bookmarks, I will view all the pages that I've bookmarked. I can add notes like I just showed you. I can highlight, and I can also go on to the assessment section. So now I want to go on to the assessment section. And these are all the assessments that I've added, right? So it's very easy to assign students assessments and follow-up activities as well. And similarly, if I go on to again tasks, then I can also link separate tasks with what I've given the students. So let's say I've given them I've practiced phonics with them and I want to add something to it. Then I can add it into my homework section and students can practice it from there. Right? So just like this, I've added a comprehension exercise over here. So you can do a lot. You can teach and reteach concepts, and then you can put everything together, right? And have students practice individually as well. Remember, the last section is to have them practice independently. So that brings us towards the end of the session. Amna, do we have any questions from the participants? We can take questions.
Yes, Ayesha. Thank you so much for the great session. And we have seen so many interesting comments and questions popping in the chat box. So quickly, I'm going to ask one question from you. Ayesha, as you have just spoken about how we can incorporate guided reading in the timetable, and especially how often should we have guided reading session within the classes?
Okay, so guided reading, it's very simple to integrate guided reading in our timetable. You can integrate it in any of your lessons. We just saw how we can integrate grammar, vocabulary, all of these things together. So you can use any of your English lessons for guided reading practice. You can also set aside some time for guided reading. So let's say 15 minutes or 20 minutes, from our daily lessons. And how often? You should at least have guided reading session once a month, once a week, right? So that's generally recommended. You can have it as often as you want, and you can have smaller sessions as well. And because with online teaching, things are so flexible, we can also have mini guided reading sessions online with different groups of students. So it doesn't have to be one long session where everybody's invited. You can invite one group of students for 10 minutes and then invite another group.
And can we take?
Yeah. Go on.
Students. Okay, thank you. Can we start reading by teaching sight words?
We can, yes, but it is recommended to teach it along with phonics. So you start off your phonic program in kindergarten, and so you start teaching sight words either, with the phonic program, or you wait for a couple of weeks before you can start introducing sight words. So the correct approach is to teach phonic first. And even with sight words that are irregular, that do not follow a phonic pattern, we identify some sounds that the students are familiar with. Like in the word me, they might not know the E sound, but they know the sound for letter M. So you would start with teaching that and then point towards the irregular or the tricky sound.
Okay, one Ayesha from you. Can we develop interest in reading before actually we are going to start reading in the classes?
Absolutely.
How can we develop?
Absolutely. I think that's a brilliant idea. That is how it should be done, actually. So, we discussed how activating background knowledge is really, really important in developing comprehension as well. So to develop an interest in reading, we can start off with discussions around, what students know about the topic that we're going to read. Have them bring in something that is related to what you're going to read. So if you're reading a story about animals, maybe they can bring their stuffed animals, or maybe they can bring in pictures of animals. Or maybe they can do animal sounds, before they get started. So you want to grab their attention before you actually start reading. So that's a very nice question.
Thank you so much, Ayesha, for taking the time out and answering all the questions. Thank you so much for your presentation. With this, we are going to move towards the end of the session. This was the day 1 of the live webinar week we have arranged for you. We have pasted the links to the feedback form along with the link to the session handouts. Thank you so much for joining in. Goodbye from our side. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for joining in.
Thank you, Ayesha.
Thanks. Bye.